Welcome to the second session of our course Greek History and Civilization 700 BC to 500 AD. Today I want to go through quite a long presentation. I want to talk about Athens and Sparta and, if possible, to contrast them and I suppose compare them. The cover slide is what it looks like. It is a meeting of the Athenian Assembly. You can see people sitting around, and some of them are standing, and somebody is speaking. This is another of my artificial intelligence generated graphics because it is very difficult to find decent pictures of a meeting of the Athenian Assembly. I therefore don't guarantee that that is an entirely accurate representation, but it looked something like that. Large numbers of people met, and somebody usually spoke to them one at a time. Now let's have a look at this map. This is Greece in the 5th century BC, and you have those two green dots on the map. I hope you can all see those. They're green or blue or turquoise. One is Athens, the other is Sparta. They look as if they're very far apart, but I can tell you that I was in the Peloponnese a few months ago, last October. It took me an hour and a half to drive from Sparta to Athens. The Greeks have some rather nice motorways. You have to pay tolls every 5 miles or so, so it's a more expensive journey than I expected. But I put my foot down, and it took an hour and a half to drive from Sparta to Athens. But in ancient times, communications were not quite so efficient. Indeed, in Greece, they were always very bad until very recently. And so Athens and Sparta were at a reasonable distance from each other. You might take a week of travelling to get from one to the other. But whether it's a week of travelling or 3 months of travelling, the distance between them in terms of geography is nothing compared with the distance between them in terms of their ways, in terms of their general outlook on life, and in terms of their general conduct. Athens is the cradle of democracy and of cultural innovation, and Sparta is the epitome of military discipline and oligarchy. You could travel from Athens to Sparta or from Sparta to Athens, and although in both cities, or both places rather, they would speak a kind of Greek that each could recognise, they might as well have been on different planets. I was a little dubious about referring to cities. Athens was certainly a city, though it was surrounded by quite a large hinterland, Attica. Athens itself had a population of maybe 30,000, but Attica, the territory of which it was the capital, had a population of 250,000, so most Athenian citizens didn't live in Athens. Sparta was hardly worth calling a city. It was a large territory ruled over by a people who lived in a collection of villages. I was in Sparta last October. There are ruins from the Roman period, but it is very difficult to find anything above ground that takes you back as far as the 5th century BC. The Spartans, on the whole, were not terribly interested in architecture. They had the great temple of Artemis Orthia, but their houses seem to have been the ancient Greek equivalent of mud huts. The purpose of today's session is to look at these diverse societies and to see what emerges from them. And something that we shall be looking at, even if only in passing, is the fact that Athens was a commercial and a naval power with a society fitting to that status, and Sparta was in every sense a militarized economy, and it was very much a land-based power. There are some pictures. That's a picture that I took last October. We walked up a mountain to Mistra, the Byzantine city that's built into the side of a mountain. When the Slavs and the Avars invaded Greece in the 6th and 7th centuries, the cities, the coastal cities, became uninhabitable. They became too dangerous. And so the government encouraged people to build new cities into the sides of mountains, and that's what we were looking at. But this is a photograph I took from near the top of the mountain, and this is the plain of Sparta. That white mass in the distance is Sparta. That is the city of Sparta, and that is where the Spartans had their collection of villages. It's not much to look at. It's rather pretty. The mountains are pretty, but not much in the way of magnificent ruins. Whereas there is something that you all recognise. We turned up too late to see it because we spent too long in the museums, but you can get a nice picture of the Acropolis from the top balcony of the Acropolis Museum, that's right. So there is the Parthenon. That is the symbol of Athens. It tells you everything you want to know about Athens, really. But let's now look at Athens in a certain detail. Athens was a democracy. I said last week it was not a total democracy. It was a democracy in which adult male citizens over the age of 18 were allowed to participate. If you were a woman, you did not participate. If you were a slave, of course you didn't participate. If you were a resident alien, you didn't participate. And a resident alien was not necessarily somebody who had moved to Athens. A resident alien or a metic might well be the son or the grandson or the great or great-great-grandson of somebody who had settled in Athens. Unlike in Rome, you did not easily acquire Athenian citizenship, and quite often you would have groups of people which were absolutely indistinguishable in their facial appearance, in their clothing, in their speech and accent, but some of them were Athenian citizens with all the rights of Athenian citizens, and some of them were resident aliens with rights to life, liberty and property, but no right to participate in the civic life of Athens. But once you take that limitation into account, Athens was a democracy, and in many respects, perhaps in most respects, apart from membership of the political nation, was a great deal more democratic than we are. Now, Athens became a democracy in stages, but one of the key events in its progress to democracy was the reforms by Cleisthenes in 508-507 BC. He finished the dismantling of aristocratic control, and he helped to establish the Assembly of the People as the sovereign law-making body of Athens. Athenian democracy involved three main bodies. There was the Ecclesia, the assembly. That was the central legislative body. That is what the cover picture represents. A meeting several times a month in the central marketplace of Athens, to which every male citizen over the age of 18 could turn up and speak and vote. And that made laws, that declared war, it ratified peace treaties, it was the sovereign assembly of the people. You then have the Boule, or the Council of 500. This was responsible for the permanent administration of Athens. I'll come in a moment to how it was filled up. You then had the Dicasteria, or the courts, and the Athenians were notably litigious, and their juries were very large. They were sometimes as large as 500 or 499 people. If you have a jury of that size, it's very difficult to bribe them. It's also very difficult to intimidate them. Now, the principles of participation, I'll say again, all male citizens over the age of 18 could participate, and this was regardless of wealth or social status. But unlike in modern England, it was a direct democracy. What we do every 5 years, or sometimes less than that, is we go into a polling station, put an X on a piece of paper, and that's it. We've been consulted, the people have spoken, and the government then continues to exist. In Athens, the assembly to which all adult male citizens were eligible to attend, that was the sovereign lawmaking body. All laws had to be voted on by the assembly. There were no elected representatives, and so in a sense Athens was a direct democracy, and that's what many people talk about nowadays when they contrast representative with direct democracies. But Athens was even more of a democracy than that. If you want to vote, you will be given a choice of candidates. These are candidates selected by their parties. Very few people bother voting for independents, and so standing as an independent is generally a waste of time. They will be acceptable to the media, and they will probably be beholden in various ways that it's not my place to explain to vested interests. The Athenians would have looked at our system and said, that's not democracy, that's a kind of electoral oligarchy. It doesn't matter whether the people decide. The names on the list that you're given are all selected by the ruling class, and so we wouldn't call this democracy. No, if the Athenians wanted somebody to look after the finances, if the Athenians wanted somebody to look after the drains, if the Athenians wanted to fill up their Council of 500, or rather when they wanted to fill up their Council of 500, they didn't ask the people to vote for candidates, because the candidates who had come forward would generally be from the higher and wealthier classes, and as in Rome, these would monopolise the administration. No, the Athenians pulled names out of a hat, or the equivalent of that. All positions, except those requiring specialised expertise, like leading an army or a fleet, all of these positions were filled up by lot, in the same way as in modern England juries are selected. Every 6 months or so, there would be a selection, and a name would be pulled out, and people would hear, oh, Theramenes, the son of Nicomedes, he's now in charge of the library. And so he would be in charge of the library for the next 6 months or the next year. There would be an audit of his financial doings while in office, but what it meant was not only could you attend meetings of the assembly regardless of wealth or social status, but you had an equal chance of being selected to serve in the administration of the city, which meant that the assembly was at all times filled with perhaps a majority of the older men who had served in all sorts of more or less important positions. If we were to try to reproduce Athenian direct democracy in the running of parish councils, you would probably have a collection of lunatics and time wasters turning up who would spend 3 hours talking about something of absolutely no importance. Whereas the Athenian assembly was attended by men who had often very considerable administrative and political experience. So the selection by lot and the open access to the assembly meant that this was not just a rubber stamp assembly, as the Roman assemblies often were. This was, in every possible sense, the sovereign law-making body of the Athenian democracy. The Athenians believed that everybody, or rather the Athenians believed that every adult male citizen should have an equal say in the government of Athens. The Athenians were rather suspicious of the rich. The rich were treated with a certain hostility by the assembly. They didn't pay very high taxes. The Athenians didn't bother much with taxes, but if you were very rich, you would be expected to provide liturgies, which is different from the modern word liturgy. If you were rich, you would be expected as a matter of course to pay for theatrical performances, or you would be expected to pay the costs of building and fitting out a warship, or you would be expected to contribute towards the rebuilding of a temple. The rich were suspected, and the rich were placed under various kinds of heavy shadow taxation. The idea was that the people ruled Athens. You must take into account the exclusion of women, slaves and foreigners from political rights, and you must accept that there will always be some influence of wealthy citizens. They're the ones with the leisure to attend meetings of the assembly. They're the ones with the leisure and the good fortune to have a good education, and so those people will be more persuasive when they stand up and speak. And of course, because Athens was a moderately large territory, as big as Yorkshire before it was divided, and it was difficult for most people to get into Athens for meetings of the assembly, and so it was a self-selected group of Athenian citizens who turned up to most meetings of the assembly. Even when you take those things into account, it was about as close to rule by the people as you can get, and it was a great deal closer to democracy in the wider sense than any modern Western society is. I'm not going to take you through this, but I've put it on a slide. If you're interested, when I send you those slides, you can look for yourself at this diagrammatic representation of the Athenian constitution. There are two of the other great democrats in Athenian history. On the left you have Themistocles, the man who persuaded the Athenians to build a large war fleet. In around 490 BC, the Athenians had the great good fortune to discover a vast silver mine about 10 miles outside Athens. The assembly at first thought, oh great, this is going to be an early experiment in social credit. What we'll do is we'll share this silver out among the citizens, so much for every citizen or so much for every household. Themistocles then stood up and made a very persuasive speech, and the Athenians decided instead to build a war fleet, which came in very handy when the Persians invaded 10 years later. On the right, you have Pericles, the man who guided Athenian democracy for many years, and whose death in the Great Plague of Athens in 429 BC is often taken to mark the beginning of the decline in the fortunes of Athens. So these are three of the great democrats: Cleisthenes, whom I showed on the previous slide, Themistocles, who inspired the building of the war fleet that saved Athens and indeed saved Greece, and Pericles, the man who guided Athenian democracy, and indeed the man who commissioned the building of the great temples on the Acropolis. The bottom right image, that is an ostrakon. One of the safeguards of Athenian democracy was that if the people thought that any one citizen was becoming too powerful and might be a danger to the continued stability of democracy, that person's name could be put before the people, and they could scratch his name on a pottery shard, and he would then be exiled from Athens for a certain number of years. So if you regard a fellow citizen as dangerous to the political stability of the city, you can get his name put before the people, and if enough of them scratch his name on a pottery shard, he's exiled. There's no judicial review. There are no actual charges. It's just, I don't like him, I want him out. It was a safeguard of democracy. Again, if anybody has any questions, do stop me. Let's now look at Sparta. Sparta was not a democracy of any kind. Sparta was a monarchy, a peculiar kind of monarchy. At any one time there were two kings in Sparta, two hereditary kings, both coming from different royal families. They shared the military leadership and religious duties between themselves. So they were the heads of the executive, two kings for life, not consuls as in Rome, elected for 1 year, but hereditary monarchs for life, but two of them from two different royal families. The kings were guided by the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, that is 28 men over the age of 60 who advised the kings on policy and on legal matters. You then have the Apella, the assembly, rather as in Athens, but whereas the assembly was at the centre of Athenian government, the Spartan assembly had very limited powers, and it mostly voted as advised by the Gerousia, and so real power in Athens lay with the Council of Elders or Gerousia and with the two kings. You then have below those two high bodies the ephors, 5 elected officials who oversaw the daily administration of Sparta. I'll come to talking about daily life in Athens a little later, what it was like to be an Athenian, but Spartan society was totally militarized. There was a very strong emphasis on discipline, on obedience, and on martial prowess. The Spartans and the other Greeks believed that the Spartan system had been set up by a man called Lycurgus, their lawgiver. He is the man they credited with the invention of the political and social system under which they lived. It is more likely that this is something that emerged over several generations, but the laws traditionally ascribed to Lycurgus emphasized a very militaristic lifestyle with an emphasis on communal living and equality among Spartans. I'll give you some long quotes from Plutarch later on, which will explain how Spartan society worked. But what I will say is that there was a small group of Spartan citizens. These people spent their entire lives training for war. They weren't carpenters, they weren't potters, they weren't shoemakers, they weren't farmers. All of that was done by other groups of people who were not Spartans and who had limited rights and sometimes no rights at all. The Spartan middle class, if you can speak of such, was resident aliens, people who had certain rights to life and property but no political rights, and all of the heavy lifting work, digging in the fields, cleaning the toilets, doing things of that nature, that was done by the helots. Those were hereditary slaves owned by the state, and these people were the majority of the inhabitants of Sparta. They were, yes, as I say, hereditary slaves. The Spartans treated their helots with great severity because they were deeply suspicious of them. They suspected, with good reason, that the helots always wanted to run away, and if they didn't want to run away, they wanted to murder all the Spartans. And there were a number of serious uprisings which were put down with great severity. Indeed, there was an institution, a rather shadowy institution in Sparta called the Krypteia, which was a kind of secret police force. It would spy on the helots, and any helot who seemed rather more intelligent than the others, any helot who seemed likely leadership potential for a future revolt was taken off and murdered. Indeed, there is a story that one day the Spartans said to the helots, anyone who is rather enterprising, anyone who'd like to become a Spartan, step forward and we'll have a look at you. A number of helots did stand forward, and the Spartans patted them on the backs and said, oh, well done, well done. Now, what we'll do is we'll take you off somewhere. And, well, they were taken off somewhere and never seen again. That is how the Spartans kept their society stable. There again is a diagrammatic representation of the Spartan system of government and of Spartan society, and you will see a mention there of the Krypteia, the secret police force which supervised the helots and kept them from rising up against their hereditary masters. Oh, here's something about Spartan social and political life. I've already explained that, so I don't need to do more than point you to that rather interesting painting by Degas from 1860. Spartan boys were taken away from their parents at a very early age, and they were brought up as wards of the state. They would spend all day, every day, running around naked and training. They were starved, they were always hungry, and they were encouraged to steal, but if they were caught stealing, they were subject to savage beatings. They would compete at feats of endurance. If you want to find a positive side to Spartan life, you might say that Spartan girls and Spartan women had a great deal more freedom than Athenian girls and women. You can see in this painting that the boys are running around naked and the girls are running around not far short of naked. The girls were also expected not to train as soldiers, but to undergo a fairly rigorous training. So that is something on the government and society of Sparta. We now come to those extracts from Plutarch, which I promised, and I'll go through those. They are quite important. This is from Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. Plutarch was a Greek. He lived in the Roman period. He lived at the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd centuries AD. He did live in Rome for many years, and he's one of the few Greek intellectuals who took the trouble to learn Latin. He never learned it particularly well, but he was unusual among Greeks so far as he did know some Latin. He also wrote a very large number of works, many of which have survived, and his collected works, in the edition that I have, fill up about 8 very thick volumes, though the Greek is accompanied by a parallel translation into Latin. His most famous works are a set of parallel biographies in which he writes up the life stories of various eminent Greeks and Romans, and this is taken from his Life of Lycurgus, the semi-legendary lawgiver of Sparta. And this is what Plutarch says about Spartan life, and he's writing about something that, for the most part, no longer existed and hadn't existed for about 300 years, but this is our best connected account of Spartan society. The father did not have power to rear the child he had fathered, but he took it and carried it to a place called an assembly hall, in which the eldest of the tribesmen sat examining the infant. If it was sturdy and strong, they gave the order to rear it, assigning to it a plot of land as one of their allotments. But if it was ill-born and deformed, they sent it away to the so-called Apotheatai, a place full of chasms beside Mount Taygetus, on the grounds that it was better neither for itself nor for the city that what had right from the start not grown well with a view to health and strength should live. That is, every newborn child was inspected by a committee of elders. If it didn't look very strong or healthy, or perhaps just not very pretty, it was taken off and thrown down a hole in the ground. Lycurgus did not put the sons of Spartan citizens under the charge of bought or hired tutors, nor was it possible for each man to rear or train his son as he wanted, but he himself took them all over immediately they were 7 years old, and enrolled them in companies, and by making them feed together and be brought up together, he accustomed them to playing together and learning together. As a ruler for them, he put in charge of the company the one who stood out in good sense and was most courageous in fighting, and they kept their eyes on this one and obeyed when he gave orders and endured it when he punished them, with the result that their education was a practice of obedience. And he continues, therefore, also as their age increased, they stepped up their exercise, cutting their hair to the skin and getting them used to walking unshod and for the most part playing naked. Having got to 12 years old, they slept together in troops and companies on beds of rushes. When they were now at this age, lovers drawn from the reputable young men associated with them, and the older men paid attention to them, both coming more frequently to the gymnasia that happening to be present when they were fighting, and making fun of one another. So it's not an ideal upbringing. It's the sort of thing that would get the social workers sharpening their pencils nowadays. Now we come to how they were starved. And they fetch as they steal, some going into gardens, others very cunningly and cautiously creeping secretly into the communal dining halls of the men. If one is caught, he gets many blows with the whip, because he seems to steal carelessly and without skill. He is not beaten for stealing, beaten for being caught. They also steal whatever food they can, learning to attack cleverly those who are sleeping or carelessly on guard. For the one who gets caught, the punishment is blows and going hungry, for they get a scanty meal, so that defending themselves against hunger by themselves, they are forced to dare and be cunning. Thus the boys steal carefully, so that it is said that one once who had stolen a fox cub, and was concealing it under his cloak, withstood being torn in the stomach by the beast with its claws and teeth, and died for the sake of remaining undetected. On the positive side, when it was necessary that the Greeks should send an army to carve up the Persians who were invading Greece, the Spartans did step up to the mark, and they saw off the Persians very notably. But what more can one say about them? Oh, what more can one say about them? The diamastigosis. That is another artificial intelligence-generated image. That's a Spartan boy being shown the whip with which he'll be beaten possibly to death. This is what Plutarch says about it. The boys in Sparta were lashed with whips during the entire day at the altar of Artemis Orthia, frequently to the point of death, and they bravely endured this, cheerful and proud, vying with one another for the supremacy as to which of them could endure being beaten for the longer time and the greater number of blows. The one who was victorious was held in especial repute. This competition is called, I've translated it as, the flagellation, or diamastigosis, and it takes place every year. The purpose of this was that boys would be chosen by lot, and as Plutarch says, they would be put before the altar of Artemis Orthia, and they would be flogged and flogged and flogged, sometimes to death. And it was considered as honourable to die under the whip as to die in battle. The boys would do their absolute best not to cry out. Again, what can one say about such a custom? I've tried to say positive things about it underneath. It demonstrated an emphasis on physical endurance and bravery. integral to instilling virtues of stoicism and resilience in young Spartans, a rite of passage marking a step towards full Spartan citizenship, hardening young bodies and so on. It is an institution which stands for itself. Again, I will say that on the one occasion in Greek history when it was absolutely necessary to have a first-class army which would see off an overwhelming attack from the greatest power in the world, it was very useful for the Greeks that the Spartans marched out of the Peloponnese and set about the Persians. But I wouldn't want to be a Spartan, and I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be a neighbour of the Spartans, let's put it that way. They were a rather frightening people. And you'll see that they are totally different from the Athenians. There is almost nothing in common between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Athenians were a commercial society with a strong emphasis on individual freedom and a determination that every single citizen, adult males, but every single adult male citizen should have an equal right to be heard in the assembly and should have an equal right to vote in the assembly. And then you have the Spartans, a very traditionalist, authoritarian government which treats individuals as the property of the state, which brings them up by taking them away from their families and then by consistently starving them until they become thieves and beating them until they become savages, and then by further toughening them through these ritual beatings. Not every Spartan boy underwent the diamastigosis, but many did. And whereas among the Greeks and the Romans it was always considered a matter of great disgrace if you had whip scars on your back, among the Spartans, if you had a mass of white scars on your back, that was a sign of honour. It was a sign of your endurance. So again, I will say, two absolutely different societies. It is very difficult to find anything in common between them, and not surprisingly, the Athenians and the Spartans, though not always at war, were always getting ready for war with each other. They worked together under duress during the great Persian invasion of 480 and 479 BC, but otherwise they regarded each other with cautious respect at best, and much more often with loathing. The Spartans despised the Athenians as soft. The Athenians were just frightened of the Spartans. And, well, how would you feel if there was a country in Europe, let's say Switzerland, just to take a random example, where this sort of thing went on and they were always invading their neighbours? We're rather lucky that such peoples do not exist in modern Europe. Let's have a look at the structure of Athenian society, however. I've said it was a democracy, but it was a free country, and so there was a distinction between rich and poor. Let's have a look. I will go over some stuff for a second time because it may have been knocked out by the telling of what it was like in Sparta. You have the body of citizens, free males with Athenian parentage, and to be an Athenian citizen you had to be born of two Athenians. It wasn't the case that if your father was an Athenian but your mother was from, I don't know, Halicarnassus or Corinth, you'd be let in. No, in order to be an Athenian citizen you had to be the son of two Athenians. These were the people who held the political rights in the great democracy. Below them you have the metics, resident aliens. As I've said, it is not the case that if you moved to Athens, you were a metic, but your children who were born in Athens might acquire Athenian citizenship. No, if you were the grandson of a metic, if you were the great-grandson of a metic, somebody who had moved to Athens 100 years earlier, 150 years earlier, somewhere deep in the mists of time, you were still a resident alien with no political rights. And it was extraordinarily difficult to become an Athenian citizen. The Romans took a very different view of the matter. The Romans handed out citizenship, not like confetti, though sometimes they did, but the Romans were rather judicious in making sure that they granted citizenship to entire cities that they conquered sometimes, or if a city freely joined with Rome in an alliance and rendered notable services, the city would be rewarded with a grant of citizenship. And when the Romans expanded into the eastern Mediterranean, and in particular in the 60s BC, when Pompey the Great put down the pirates, put down Mithridates, and he also swept through Syria, making sure that the Parthians didn't get a foothold on the eastern Mediterranean shoreline, and he went down into the Jewish areas and sorted out various civil wars there. On his journey through Asia, Pompey handed out tens of thousands of grants of citizenship. To become a Roman citizen was not easy, but it was easily possible. Indeed, one of the easiest ways to become a Roman citizen was to be a slave owned by a Roman citizen. If your master freed you, you automatically became a Roman citizen. You didn't have the right to stand for office, and there were some other limitations on your rights as a citizen, but your children had the same rights as any other Roman citizen. The Athenians, and generally speaking the other Greeks, took a much more restrictive view. Not only did they confine citizenship to the children of two other citizens, that is a law which can be changed, you can loosen it, but citizenship of Athens was not a legal category in the charge of whatever counted as the Athenian state. It was something that arose from membership of one of the clans or membership of one of the families that comprised the Athenian population. I once had a conversation with one of my African students, and I asked her, "So how do I become a Kenyan citizen?" And she said, "Well, you have to apply for it. I think you have to live there for 7 years and not have a criminal record and not be obviously mad and all the usual things." And I understood that. And then I said, "So how would I become a member of your tribe?" And at that point she gave me a funny look and said, "Oh, you can't do that because, well, you're not one of us. I'm sorry, but you can't be one of us. In order to be a member of my tribe, you've got to be a member of my tribe." Now, you can apply that to Athens. There was no separate category of Athenian citizenship. You were an Athenian citizen by virtue of your membership of one of those family tribes. And so you can see that enrolling new citizens was not impossible, because by a special grant of the assembly it was possible for a foreigner to be naturalised. But this was a most unusual thing, and there was a tendency throughout Greek history for their populations to decline simply because the established citizenry tended to die out. You contrast this with the Roman custom, the Roman usage of granting citizenship to anyone who might be a decent member of Roman society. And that does help to explain how it was that the Romans rolled up the whole of the Mediterranean world into their empire, and the Athenians never did. So that's citizens and metics. A very clear distinction, though if you were to go back to Athens and look around, I'm perfectly sure that you and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between citizens and metics. You then have the slaves. I've said that this was the largest group, but we really don't know. We don't know how many slaves there were in Athens, and we don't know what proportion the slaves were. It's possible that about a third of the population of Athens was enslaved, and this estimate is based on a head count done by the French ambassador in Constantinople in the 16th century, who counted the number of slaves in the city. We extrapolate from that to various ancient societies and we come up with about a third, but we don't know. Slaves had no political rights. That's what you can say about slaves. It's one of the definitions of being a slave, that you have no political rights. You don't exist as a human being. You are a human tool. It was rather worse to be an Athenian slave than a Roman slave. The Romans have a reputation for treating their slaves very badly. You think of those awful slave revolts and the mass crucifixions. On the other hand, the Romans could be very generous with granting freedom to their slaves. It was considered a perfectly proper thing to do for a man in his will to set many of his slaves free. The Athenians hardly ever granted freedom to their slaves. Once a slave in Athens, always a slave. There were exceptions, but for the most part, slavery was a lifelong category. What else could I say about Athenian slaves? Yes. If by some stroke of good fortune you had a master who freed you, you did not become an Athenian citizen. All that happened was that you resumed whatever status you had possessed before you were enslaved, and if you'd been born into slavery, you would assume your parents' status. So if you were a Corinthian enslaved in a war, and then you were freed, you wouldn't become an Athenian, you would simply revert to being a Corinthian. Women, I said last week that women were largely invisible in Athens. I don't entirely accept the rather wide claims made in the standard course book for the A-level classical civilization course, which says that women were absolutely invisible in Greek life in general. That isn't the case. There's a great mass of stories in Plutarch's minor works which often show women running businesses, women running pubs and inns, women doing things. But among the higher classes, women were kept in Pyrrhida. There were the women's quarters at a house. So if you visit a friend in Athens, you have to announce that you're going to visit, because before you knock on the door and are allowed in, all the women in the house have to be shoved upstairs into the women's quarters and locked away. You may then enjoy a very nice dinner with your host, entertained by flute girls, dancing boys, and what have you, but it's, apart from the dancing boys and the flute girls, a men-only occasion. Women did not join in these communal activities. But let's leave aside the women, let's leave aside the slaves, let's leave aside the metics, let's focus on the Athenian men. Your education, if you got one, and most Athenians were too poor to get anything that we would regard as an education, but if you got an education, it would focus very much on rhetoric, philosophy, and physical education. The purpose of this education was to produce well-rounded citizens capable of contributing to the democratic life of Athens, and of course capable of serving Athens in the fleets and in the armies of the democracy. It is not the case that Athens was a place where everybody was free and equal. It was a place where citizens were free and where they enjoyed legal equality, but there were very large divergences of wealth among Athenian citizens. Some were very rich, some were very poor, And it doesn't matter how much attention the law pays to enforcing equality among citizens. When you do have distinctions of wealth of this kind, they will have a way of making themselves felt. Although the Athenians were suspicious of the rich, although they put the rich under various burdens, there is no doubt that the rich had an influential role in Athenian life. They didn't dominate, as in Rome, but they did have a very important role in Athenian life, and there was certainly a distinction of birth. Someone like Plato, who was very well born, would not easily mix with somebody who was low born. His good friend Socrates was an exception because Socrates had certain outstanding qualities, but you would mostly keep within your own class. Athenian cultural life. Now what can I say about Athenian cultural life? The answer is many things, but I need to summarise. Let me give a list of names. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. These are names which we still know. They're still on school reading lists. There are still theatres in London putting on their plays. We may not have read the texts, we may not have read them in Greek or even in English translation, but we're certainly aware that they exist. We certainly know of those men, and they were Athenians. They were the most famous of the Athenian playwrights, and leaving them aside, there were many other Athenian playwrights. One of my colleagues once assured me that he had made a calculation, and in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, he calculated that in Athens alone, 16,000 plays had been written and performed, and so there was an immense theatrical literature in Athens. Not much of it has survived because it was a long time ago, and time is the enemy of all human achievements, but enough has survived. Enough of the very best of Athenian theatre has survived, and it is still highly regarded. You then have the Athenian contribution to philosophy, and the name of Socrates and of Plato. Those two names tend to float above all the others. And something else that I'd say about Athenian philosophy is that very often Athens was filled with philosophers, but they were not Athenian citizens. They were metics. They were people who'd settled in Athens. People like Aristotle. He wasn't an Athenian. He was from a northern city. But he lived in Athens and he contributed to the intellectual life of the city. Epicurus, he wasn't born in Athens, but he was an Athenian citizen. The great philosophers were either Athenians by birth or they lived in Athens. And by not in the classical period, not necessarily in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, but by the end of the 4th century and from the 3rd century onwards, Athens was preeminently the philosophical centre of the Greek and then of the Mediterranean world. You had what amounted to entire philosophical universities. You had I won't give the names, you had the school of Plato, where you had tenured professors teaching the philosophy of Plato as they understood it to a very large number of paying students. You had the Aristotelians, you had the Stoics, you had the Epicureans. These were large and flourishing schools of philosophy in Athens, to which Greeks would flock, or young Greek men would flock to complete their education, and from the end of the 3rd century BC onwards, wealthy young Romans would take themselves to Athens to complete their education. They would spend several years in Athens, perfecting their Greek so that they could speak it without any accent, and generally absorbing Greek civilization in Athens. You have the arts of the Athenians, all of those statues, all of those buildings, and again, Greek art was not something purely developed by the Athenians in Athens. It was a general movement to which many Greeks contributed, but all of the greatest works of art tended to be in Athens and were often created by Athenians. And if you take yourselves to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens or to the Acropolis Museum, you will see a vast succession of artistic masterpieces dug up from the Athenian soil during the past few hundred years. So you have the philosophy, you have the art, you have the literature, all the literature. I've mentioned the plays. You also have the histories. Now again, Herodotus, he was not an Athenian. He was born in Halicarnassus. He also didn't speak or write Attic Greek. He wrote the Greek dialect of his own city, but that was very close to the Athenian dialect. And although Herodotus was not an Athenian, he had a long and very close association with Athens, and Athens in the collective sense is one of the heroes of his history. You then have Thucydides, perhaps the greatest of all historians, ancient or modern, and he was entirely an Athenian. You have Xenophon, another very considerable historian and Greek writer. He was an Athenian. And so what we can say is that the Athenians were outstanding in literature, whether plays or histories or dialogues or philosophical writings of various kind. The Athenians tended to be preeminent in philosophy, and the Athenians made notable contributions to the visual arts and to architecture. Athens was the school of Greece, and when you think about the Greek achievement, you mostly think about what was done in Athens. It was a remarkable place. It was a place where people enjoyed not total freedom of speech. There are examples of where the Athenian courts behaved rather harshly, by Athenian standards at least, to people who spoke too much out of turn. But for the most part, it was expected that Athenian citizens, and indeed anyone resident in Athens, would enjoy a degree of freedom of speech that we ourselves don't possess. The plays of Aristophanes are often extraordinarily brutal towards very popular and well-connected politicians. They mercilessly pillory the leading politicians in Athens, calling them the most horrible things. Passive male homosexuals. The Athenians didn't care about the homosexuality, but they certainly cared about the passiveness. Accusing people of corruption, accusing people of incompetence, and those men were expected to sit in the theatre and join in the laughter and the applause, and Aristophanes got away scot-free with it. I would not say that Athens was a perfect society. I said that there was a distinction between rich and poor, and those people who were poor could be very poor. There was certainly a distinction between Athenian citizens and resident aliens, and a very sharp distinction between Athenian citizens and slaves, and there was a sharp distinction between Athenian men and Athenian women. This is not a utopia. It is not a place where everyone is equal, but it was a place where every available effort was made to ensure that adult male citizens all had an equal chance to develop themselves as best they could. That's the most you can say about Athens, and I would suggest that it's a lot that you can say about them, because it's very hard to think of any other society, ancient or modern, where there has been so much concern to ensure that even a minority of the citizens will have some degree of equality and will all have an equal right to self-development and an equal opportunity to display their talents for their own service and for the service of their country. It was also a place which was not only notable but completely outstanding in the arts, in ancient terms in the sciences, and in philosophy. When I was a boy, I used to sit around with various older relatives and we'd play a game called Where Would You Like to Have Lived? Where and when would you have liked to live? And I usually chose Athens, I sometimes chose Rome. Nowadays, now that I'm older, and now that I appreciate the benefits of modern dentistry, and now that I know a great deal more about these places, I would be very happy to visit as a tourist. I would have a full round of vaccinations before I set out. I would make sure to have my teeth descaled by the dentist and any fillings replaced that were a little loose. And I would take a good supply of antibiotics and a decent supply of coinage with me. But I would be very happy to spend 6 months in Athens in those circumstances. I don't think I'd like to pass through Sparta. It would be a place that I travelled through very quickly and where I would permanently feel a hand on my shoulder until I was 20 or 30 miles outside the zone of Spartan influence. That is my personal view. However, although I haven't spoken in any very positive terms about the Spartans, I will say again that the Spartans did their job when the Persians turned up, and the Spartans have also been an inspiration for many philosophers and politicians in modern and in early modern Europe. When Rousseau wrote his Social Contract, and he tried to think of a utopia in which everyone would be free and equal, he didn't take his inspiration from Athens, he took it from Sparta. And you can think of many other English, German, and French philosophers who have been inspired by the Spartan ideals of total devotion to the public good and of the shaping of the young generation away from frivolity and vice and towards duty and military service. I suspect that those philosophers in the modern period who have been most inspired by the Spartans didn't actually know very much about the Spartans, but one must appreciate that the Spartans did have some good qualities. They must have had some. But let's come back to the Athenians. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides, you have a large number of set-piece speeches. These are not verbatim transcripts of speeches actually given. These are summaries and rewordings of what Thucydides himself heard. But here is a very famous passage from a speech given by Pericles, one of the great guiders of Athenian democracy. I call him a guider because the Athenians didn't on the whole have leaders. They had people whom the assembly would allow to guide it. But this is what Pericles said in his funeral oration for the fallen dead of Athens after the first year of the Great War with Sparta. What he says is this: Our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. Our government does not copy our neighbours, but is an example to them. It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while there exists equal justice to all and alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognised, and when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. Neither is poverty an obstacle, but a man may benefit his country, whatever the obscurity of his condition. There is no exclusiveness in our public life, and in our private business we are not suspicious of one another, nor angry with our neighbour if he does what he likes. We do not put on sour looks at him, which, though harmless, are not pleasant. While we are thus unconstrained in our private business, a spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws, having a particular regard to those which are ordained for the protection of the injured, as well as those unwritten laws which bring upon the transgressor of them the reprobation of the general sentiment. Of course, this is propaganda. It's a political speech, and it is a speech made on a particular occasion when it's necessary to tell grieving parents that their sons did not die in vain. But it must contain a great deal of truth. There is no doubt that in their private lives, Athenian citizens were pretty unconstrained. You could believe what you liked, you could say what you liked. Within rather wide bounds, you could do what you liked. You didn't have to take an interest in public affairs. You could refuse to attend meetings of the assembly. If that was the case, that was your choice. But if you did attend a meeting of the assembly, you had the right to vote, and if you felt inclined and you were competent enough not to be shouted down by the audience, you could stand up and you could make a speech putting your point of view. And if you put forward your point of view with sufficient persuasiveness, your point of view might well become the policy of the Athenian state. You must always hedge statements about the Athenians around with reservations, I'll say again. This was a democracy enjoyed by male citizens of Athens. It did not include Athenian women, it did not include resident aliens, and it certainly did not include slaves, and those together were surely the great majority of the Athenian population. And there was a distinction between rich and poor, an inevitable distinction, but once you make those allowances, I think it is difficult not to accept that something strange was happening in Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. You have a burst of enlightenment, a burst of creativity in almost every sphere, and at the same time you have a remarkably open system of government. And it is possible to imagine a democracy in which everybody has the right to vote, has the right to turn up in an assembly and to speak and vote, but which happens to be a very authoritarian place because that's what the majority of the people in the assembly want. But Athens was not that. It was a place where the assembly usually limited itself. It did not make a strict inquiry into people's private lives. It did not make windows into men's souls. It was, except that at my age I do appreciate modern medicine, it was a rather pleasant place to be, which is one reason why Athens contained so many resident aliens. If you wanted to live well, you would take yourself to Athens. It was a large city, one of the largest in the Greek world. It was a wealthy city because of the trade, and it was also a remarkably open society, and a society marked by the highest levels of creativity. That's what one can say about the Athenians. Let's turn to economic matters. Trade and maritime activities. I've said already that Athens was very largely a commercial power. There was a certain amount of agriculture around Athens in the territory of Attica, but by the middle of the 5th century, I would say, it was very difficult for the Athenians to feed themselves. They relied on the regular importation of corn from places like the Ukraine and the Crimea. They relied on imported food. It's difficult to say what most people in Athens did, but there was a very large craft industrial sector. There's an image of a pot, which I took in the National Archaeological Museum a few months ago. These were not just works of art, these were export goods. Athens specialised in the production of fine pottery, and you'll find Athenian fine pottery all through the eastern and western Mediterranean worlds. Athens was within the limits established by the fact that it was an ancient society. Athens was a financial centre. It was a commercial centre. It was a financial centre, it was a manufacturing centre, and it had the advantage of those silver mines, which allowed the Athenians to produce a coinage, a silver coinage, which was recognised and respected throughout the Mediterranean world. The strength of the system is that Athens was Athens. The weakness of the system, a very high dependency on imported grain, especially from the Black Sea. And when the Spartans defeated the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian War, it was by winning a number of naval battles and cutting off the Athenian trading connections with the Black Sea. So that's the Athenian economy. The Spartan economy, almost entirely based on agriculture, and the agriculture was sustained by the labour of the Helots, who were slaves owned by the state. There were no large land holdings in Sparta. Land was redistributed to ensure equality among the citizens and to eliminate differences of wealth. The Spartans did not have a gold and silver coinage. Instead, such money as they used was rather large iron discs. The idea was that if the only coins that were legal tender were large iron discs, nobody would bother hoarding these coins, and there was a strong discouragement of luxury. Luxury among the Spartans hardly existed. Luxury, as the Spartans might have defined it, was 3 meals a day. On the other hand, among the Spartan citizens, the minority, the militarized citizenry of Sparta, there was a high degree of cohesion and a high degree of trust. It meant that when those 300 Spartans stood up at Thermopylae and gave their lives, every one of them knew that he could rely absolutely on the man who was fighting beside him, and that the people fighting beside him would not turn around and run away when the Persians came on in particularly overwhelming numbers. What more can I say? Not a lot, or rather there is a lot more that I could say, but I've given an overview of those 2 leading societies in Greece, and there, if you're interested in looking further, is a reading list of about 20 works. I would recommend the Hammond book, A History of Greece to 322 BC. Simon Hornblower's The Greek World, 479 to 323, that's also highly recommended. And the others, they're rather more specialised, but I put them on a list for a purpose. That is all that I will say, because we've come very close to the end. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this?